What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Venue RX. On this show, we document and share best practices around owning, operating, and managing world-class wedding venues. And today we have a special series. We are actually doing a limited series with my good friend, Lindsay Lucas. We're going to be talking about all of the steps that it takes to get a venue open and what considerations should you have and everything like that. So Lindsay, thank you so much for co-hosting with me.
No, thank you so much for asking. It always feels like an honor that I get to come on here. We always have a blast, and I'm looking forward to the series.
Oh, this is going to be great. We're going to dive through so many topics, and without further ado, let's jump in.
All right. Eventually, the weddings take over because it's way more profitable. If you have a business mindset, it's hard to go back to just being Airbnb.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on an episode of this limited series all about starting a venue. And I'm here with my co-host, Lindsay.
Hey, guys. I'm excited for this. This is going to be great.
Yeah, this is going to be awesome. So today we're going to talk Airbnb because many people, and this was actually Lindsay's suggestion, and I think it's fantastic. Lindsay, why did you suggest this?
Well, I get a lot of inquiries from people that they're running very successful Airbnb businesses, obviously attracting a lot of attention, whether they're on Airbnb or VRBO or any other platform. And so the short-term rental is seeing a lot of success, but then they're also starting to field wedding inquiries. And so obviously at that point, their ears perk up and they're like, well, I have the property, I have the space, especially if it's like elopements, micro weddings, things like that. They may not have the space for something larger, but it piques their interest and they start seeing the money on the table. And so that's when all of the questions start arising.
Totally. And I've had several people, and we were just chatting before we got on, I just was out in Texas, and a couple people, they started on the Airbnb VRBO side of things. They said, we're doing well, we can command a higher ticket price if we include weddings or create weekend packages that allow events. Because most Airbnbs, I think it's up to the host, but they don't allow parties, correct?
Right. Yeah. In fact, that's one of the things that I wanted to touch on in today's episode is if you pay attention, if you have a short-term rental that's on one of the marketing platforms like Airbnb or VRBO, if you pay attention and you read their terms and conditions, they actually don't allow you to book weddings and outside events from just the short-term rental. And so a lot of times if I have actually talked to a handful of people that are like, we had this opportunity, we said yes, which I love the enthusiasm, right? I love a go-getter attitude, but it got them shut down and kicked off of Airbnb, right? And so then it's like, oh no, I'm scrambling, what do I do now?
Yeah. Let's dive into some of the things that you might want to consider if you have a successful Airbnb and you want to start getting into events. When I say that, what comes to mind for you?
Operations, okay. Which I know that's going to be right up your alley, right? So, I think that a lot of people that are having success on, let's just say Airbnb, they get an inquiry about a wedding and they immediately want to say yes, right? Because they feel like I can obviously get a lot more money, have a lot more revenue coming in, see this great opportunity. And usually it's an easy, or what appears to be an easy opportunity, right? They're already going to be on site. They just want an elopement. I can probably call my friend who is a certified officiant, come down here and I can put this little package together and execute and everything will be great, right? And in theory, yes, you could probably do that. But there's a lot more, as you know, that goes into it whenever you start saying yes a whole lot more often and word starts to spread and this thing starts snowballing and you've been kind of flying by the seat of your pants and it's eventually going to catch up to you, right? So if you want to make this a successful revenue stream, there's things you need to take into consideration.
Definitely. And I think we should probably both be clear. We're not saying don't make the transition between Airbnb and wedding venue. There are absolutely some things you need to consider if you're thinking of making that shift. Why don't we even go back a little bit more? What about things like, obviously the platform, we just talked about that. What about stuff like, zoning? Certain properties in my experience, they are zoned and someone does get, the STR license, the short-term rental license, and they'll get that from their city or county or, whoever the governing body is there, and they'll have that. But that, just because you have a STR does not mean that you have a major use permit for a venue, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then some people are like, well, maybe it's better to ask for forgiveness than for permission, right? And that can potentially open up a can of worms for you too. So it's just kind of like, what's your risk tolerance here, basically, with this?
Yeah. The interesting thing about that is a lot of times, I think it depends on the government environment in your area. So this is not going to apply.
Yeah, the county regulations are definitely going to dictate a lot.
So much. And if you're in an area where you know that you can get away with a little bit more, that model of asking for forgiveness versus permission totally might work. I've personally experienced it where we have had venue owners that have done that. And then the penalty, the asking for forgiveness side, it's not just asking for forgiveness. There are, hey, you have 60 weddings booked. You can't book more than 20. We'll let you complete the 20. Or no, we need you to cancel all of them. And when you've taken deposits and when you're after COVID and anything to do with cancellations and weddings is not, it's not a conversation you want to have at all.
Yeah. So I usually, when I get inquiries and I'm on the phone with a consult, I usually recommend that they call up to their county and just toss out a hypothetical. If I wanted to do this, am I allowed? If I wanted to do this, what would it look like? If I wanted to do this and I'm not allowed, what does it look like for a rezoning process or to get a permit or a license? Is it a permit per wedding, or am I able to get licensed for my whole property all year long? Just start kind of throwing out hypotheticals and getting more information. And before you even call and throw out hypotheticals, you could get on the website and search for the Economic Development Department and see if they have zoning requirements and anything listed on the website first.
I love that you mentioned the Economic Development Department. That's getting in touch with folks there. They will know what is allowed or what's not allowed. And if you don't have something that has that formal title in your area, you can again call. But Lindsay, what about people that are a little bit nervous if they start saying, hey, hypothetically, if I have a venue or I have a big property and I want to host weddings, like, isn't there some risk maybe in starting to admit that they're going to do this? Like, do you feel like that's a valid concern?
Yeah, any concern is valid, right? So again, it goes back to what's your risk tolerance? And so and you're not committing to anything. Like when you're calling and just asking, and you don't even have to say hypothetically, right? Because that could potentially throw up some red flags. But if you're like, hey, I have been asked a couple of times by family and friends, I'm still looking into it to see what this commitment level is going to take on my part, which led me here to you. What does it look like from a zoning perspective? Am I even allowed to do this?
I love that. I've done in the past where I've said, hey, I'm considering purchasing a property in the area, but just want to know what are the regulations around, events and things like that. And then it becomes very hypothetical, which I know people will probably ask for the address, oh, what address and what's the current zoning? But these things, the zoning side of it, you really have to think about it, because that is what will bite you in the butt, and it will take several years to catch up to you, and it will catch up to you when you're already seeing some measure of success, which then you'll have to walk back on.
Yes, good point. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so let's kind of go. So we talked a little bit about, zoning. Obviously, there are the typical residential, there's R1, R2, some of the different ones. There's agricultural properties, and I think a lot of our listeners probably, if they have an Airbnb that has some venue space on it, probably is going to be rated ag. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, the majority of the clients that I work with are very, very rural. So most of the properties are zoned to ag, and they have a little bit of some leniency within their zoning laws. Most of them do. So that's definitely helpful.
When you say leniency, are you talking about a certain amount of allowable events per parcel or something like that? Or what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So a lot of times they'll have a certain number of events that they have to stay under. And then they'll also say, X number of events, X number of people, right? So they'll put that tag on there as well. But then sometimes in a lot of counties, they're like, it's your property, we don't care. And of course, and I think we've had a conversation on this in a previous episode as far as like, there's a process within whenever you're rezoning, and at a certain process or at a certain stage of the process, there is a public meeting that's held. And so at that point, if any neighbors have caught wind and they're like, I'm not really comfortable with having 200 people right next to my house every single weekend or multiple times a weekend, then they show up, voice their concern, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get things shut down. But it is an area for you to be aware of and to prepare in case you need to get up and give a speech and kind of mitigate their concerns a little bit.
Hey there, wanted to take a quick break and share a little bit about Common Sense Events and the consulting services that we provide. In the past year, Common Sense Events has been able to partner with several venues and provide consulting services around everything from marketing, sales, and operations. We've worked with families helping smooth out operational hiccups. We've worked with teams to help their marketing departments book more events, and we've worked with sales teams to make sure they're able to have higher converting tours. So if that sounds interesting to you, we would love to have a conversation about that. You can contact us at venues@cseventservices.com. You can honestly just reach out on, you can also just reach out on the podcast and send us a DM if this is interesting to you. But we would love to talk with you and see if there's a way that we can partner with you and your venue and help make your venue run smoother. All right, back to the show. There's so much that we could cover on this. Like the prep side of this, I think is really important. Like if you want to get, a venue started, you're planning on buying a property, or you currently have a property, those things like understanding the wedding planners who live in your area, the vendors, who you're going to have to talk to, who the different representatives are from the county, people in the EDD, right? Like who are you going to have to talk to? And if you have ways to connect with them, even little stuff like on LinkedIn, or if they have a Twitter account or whatever, to start understanding who these people are, that's going to go so far whenever you're in that zoning phase. And then it's like, oh, hey, like, what's up? Good to see you, versus like, I'm this kind of new person in the area who wants to start this thing that could disrupt the status quo.
Well, and that kind of like, you're bringing up a good point is, and I know obviously you're into real estate like I am, we have these conversations all the time. And so, this as good as I do, that your network is your net worth, right? And so getting familiar with the public officials and who is, making the decisions at the county, rubbing elbows, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah. So cool. We have a good, foundation, I guess. Let's move. We have the Airbnb. Let's say it's successful. We have our short-term, vacation rental permit. We're good to go there. We've had all these stays. At what point, like for you, if someone was asking what point is kind of crossing the line, like what's the difference between allowing someone for an additional fee to have 80 people for like a rehearsal dinner or a small wedding or something like that? What's the difference between that and actually making the transition into being able to position yourself as a wedding venue?
Yeah. Well, I'm always going to be a big fan of self-sufficiency, right? Like being able to stand on my own 2 feet. And I think all of these platforms are wonderful. I really do, especially, they're necessary in your startup phase. As long as you're abiding by their terms and conditions. So if you have a very successful short-term rental on Airbnb and Airbnb's terms and conditions say no weddings, then you kind of have to, you do have to respect that if you want to keep your current revenue stream alive and well. But if weddings are fruitful enough for you and you've taken a look at the projections, you've taken a look at the zoning, and you feel like there's green flags to move forward, then I would start looking at building your own website, doing your own marketing, and standing on your own 2 feet as far as that's concerned. And then the revenue streams, there will be a point in the journey to where the wedding venue is way more profitable potentially than what your rentals are. And then the rentals become the subset to the venue itself.
In my operations experience, that happens over like a 6-month period. It's happened like 3 times. There's existing Airbnbs, and then we start booking weddings, and then soon the Airbnbs become kind of obnoxious to schedule, because you're like, I have this wedding and I have this wedding and I have this wedding, and you're now positioned around the weddings. And at a certain point, there is a tipping point, depending on how fast you go. But for us, it's been about 6 months where we've just said, hey, the Airbnb revenue, just like the rental days and then having to come in and turn the place and all of that, it doesn't make sense versus just focusing on a wedding couple who's going to come in and pay way more than you can command on the nightly price.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you put that time frame of 6 months on there, because I feel like the inquiries that I get, they're thinking that it's going to take much longer than what it usually does, which is a great surprise for them.
Yeah. Oh, totally. And I think it all depends on how fast you go. Like if you're intentional about starting the venue and you're hiring a team, or you're doing it yourself, or like whichever way you're trying to manage the venue, depending on how fast that goes, it could take pretty quickly. It's taken 6 months for us because we already have a team. We get in there and we go. So yeah, I should put a qualifier on there. Like if you're doing everything yourself, it may take longer for sure. I want to mention one thing about the Airbnb kind of switch over as well. Have you talked to people that have been positioned as like, hey, we're an Airbnb, but we do some weddings, versus we're a wedding venue that does some overnights?
Like what? Give me a specific. Like, what do you mean?
So someone who's like, hey, we're primarily Airbnb, we're on Airbnb, but then we'll do some small events. So like, not the focus of the venue is not like weddings and events. The focus is more like we're overnight accommodations, we're weekend experiences, we're whatever. But then if you want to have your event, they have extra amenities on there, maybe a chef that comes in, or maybe they arrange tours to local wine country or whatever.
Yeah. Again, I think that they'll start out that way, right? But it goes back to the example that you just explained, as far as eventually the weddings take over because it's way more profitable, right? So like, if you have a business mindset, it's hard to go back to just being Airbnb. So I don't know if I'm answering your question completely.
No, yeah, you are. I think maybe there's some people that don't want to jump in. If they're getting some success, or they're having some current success with their Airbnb, it's like, oh wow, that is a huge operational lift to go in the venue side. And I mean, you mentioned it right as we started this episode. So I have one venue specifically in mind. They dabbled with doing events for so long because they wanted to stay on the Airbnb platform, and they didn't really want the events to be the main, even though it was a main revenue driver. They didn't want to jump into like everything they knew would be needed. And I mean, I don't know, what's your take on that? Like, is that just like a little bit of fear maybe?
Well, I think it just depends on your priorities, like the work-life balance. A lot of times for some business owners, the work-life balance is a really high priority. And so you can't buy their time at all if you wanted to. And so I think that is something really to take into consideration if there's been a lot of success within the short-term rental, and then you start getting these opportunities, really taking a hard look of, right now I'm running this Airbnb. It's not completely passive. I don't think that there's a lot of truly passive business models out there, but I have a property management company that takes 20%, and it's still supporting my lifestyle. I'm still very happy, and I'm working 5 hours a week, right? Versus if we put in this wedding venue side and this additional revenue stream, all of a sudden, instead of working 5 hours a week, I'm working 20, 30, and eventually maybe even 40 hours a week, right? And then I'm hiring a venue manager because I have too much on my plate, and I'm freed up for a little bit, but then I'm taking on all of these other higher level things, which is the natural progression. I know we're later going to do an episode on investor versus CEO versus manager, and like the difference in the natural progression of the life cycle of that. But it's definitely something to take into consideration. What does the work-life balance look like for an STR versus a wedding venue? Is that something that you want?
Totally. For anyone who heard that just now and was like, crap, like that sounds like a lot of work. Does it have to be that way? Like, is there some in between?
Yeah, no, it doesn't have to be that way. So I have actually had a handful of clients that they came to me knowing like, I only want to work 15 weekends a year. So I want to structure my wedding venue to where there's an application process for my clients coming in. I have 15 weekends and that's it. And they weren't even seasonal. They were open year round, saying, this is all that I want because I want to travel with my husband. I want to see my kids' sporting events, like whatever the case is, right? Like they did their due diligence. They took a hard look at what work-life balance would look like. And they've come and said, this is what I want to do. I need you to help me make it happen. Cool. Let's do it.
The finance side of that, I feel like also plays into it because, like, let's say you bought the property with the intent to do Airbnbs, rentals, things like that, or maybe you bought it as an investment property, and that's the way you're not putting a rental tenant in there, you're putting Airbnbs, the short-term side. Depending on how you've purchased it, and, the monthly amount, a consideration is, are you going to have to put in improvements to be able to set it up for a wedding? And will the loan on that or will the payments on that be such so you're forced into a situation where you have to be open more and booking more weddings than you really want to with that work-life balance that you just talked about?
Yeah. So, that's like the catch-22 of it all, right? Like money always comes into play. You have to make sure that you're not running a hobby, you're running a business. So that's part of the due diligence on the owner's part. That's part of their responsibility is crunching all the numbers, looking at the projections, looking at the overhead, the bottom line, what's the profit margin of this potentially? And then if all the numbers check out, what is my life going to look like?
Hey there, pardon the interruption. I wanted to take a moment and share with you about WEVA. WEVA is a professional association we started last year for venue owners and operators. It stands for Wedding and Event Venue Association, and it's the first professional association for venue owners and operators, specifically providing resources, education, and networking opportunities for venue owners and operators. Let's face it, owning a venue is very difficult, and if you own or operate a venue, or if you're considering owning or operating a venue, you need resources, networking, and a community that understands and supports you and your goals as you continue to grow your business. WEVA is just that. We've built it to be a support to you as you grow your venue business, and we want you inside of our community. So if this sounds interesting to you, please click on the link in the description in this video or wherever this video is linked, and we would love to welcome you into the community.
Yeah, what's actually required, and can you hire someone if you didn't want to do it to be able to do it? Lindsay, I want to wrap this conversation just about the switch from Airbnb to venue by listing out some of the things that you should do, like some of the steps that you'd take if you have decided, and maybe some of the questions, right, to ask. So we already talked about a couple of them. How much do you want to work? How much, investment are you going to make to the property? Like, is it ready for weddings right now, or are you going to have to build something or adapt something? What are other things that people need to consider, as they make the decision to go from Airbnb to more dedicated venue?
Yeah. So we talked about all of those that you just mentioned. We also talked about zoning, asking those questions to the economic development department. I would also consult your attorney. I would get a really, really good contract in place. If you're definitely moving forward, I would have a conversation with your insurance agent. What is insurance for this going to look like? Another thing to look at, depending on, so let's just say they're wanting to host larger weddings. If it's a business model, it's like I'm only hosting 15 weekends a year. We are capping it at 75 people per wedding. We're only doing elopements and micro weddings. Then you may not have to take a look at your well and septic, but like anything that's more frequent of a higher volume and capacity, you might have to get on a public well and water system. Or septic system, I'm sorry.
And what if that doesn't exist, or what if the area doesn't support that?
You'll have to add it. That's about a $50,000 cost.
Got it. Okay, so that's an important consideration depending on where you're at. I was thinking while you were talking, is there a number of events that if you're under that, I would not pursue economic development department Like, is there kind of a minimum threshold that's a break-even point, or not a break-even point, but like a break point between, okay, we're going to ask for forgiveness versus, or beg for forgiveness versus ask for permission versus, hey, we really need to do this? What number of events is that for you?
I think that's specific to each person's risk tolerance, right? Like for me, I'm a little bit more of a risk taker. And so if it's just elopements, great. Like I'd probably just do elopements if it were me, depending on, the market and where I was at and that sort of thing. If we're looking at getting into hosting more than elopements, then you start looking at potential liability risk, and there's other factors that come into play with having proper insurance in place.
I was thinking the number that I just had in my head was 8. Like if you're planning on having more than 8 events per year, and again, depending on, there's so many things, like if it's in California versus you're in Texas, you're on the East Coast somewhere, you're in the Midwest, you do have to think about that, but you're thinking about your neighbors. Like, do you have neighbors in the area? Are you going to be causing a disturbance? Even if you do have a major use permit, you're still going to, if you have any residential around you, you're still going to have some of those good neighbor policies. But with 8 events, it's low enough. And if they're under 100 people, it's a low enough impact where it will be not consistent enough to
draw attention.
Draw attention. And then also on the other side, if you go through all of the work that it's going to take to get all these permits and everything, it may not, the 8 events you plan on doing it's not going to make sense. Just financially with the amount of commitment you're going to have to put in, time, effort, and energy. At that point, if you're going to do 8 and you're going to go get the MUP, you might as well do 18 or 28 or 38 and really do as much as you can.
Yeah.
What about, so you mentioned a contract, you mentioned insurance. What other things are kind of like good steps to take or boxes to check as you're going through this process?
Yeah. So the 2 areas of business, and I don't care what business you're starting, that you just never skimp on is going to be your legal and your insurance. So that'll be, if you're wanting to move forward with it, that would be like the very next thing that I would cover. And then you're putting, checking out all of your finances, making sure all of that's good to go. If there's any renovations that need to be done on the property, if you already have like your cabins for your short-term rentals, but you need to add, some sort of building to host the events in, taking a look at any new construction costs and things like that, all of that goes into your finances. But then taking a look at the operations side. Are there investments that you need to make within the operational side with software, CRM, project management, that sort of thing? Is this something that you can handle on your own, or do you need to hire a venue manager? Or can you have a conversation with your property management team that has already been in place executing for your short-term rentals? Is this a conversation that you could have with them? And they would want to maybe increase your package or whatever that could potentially look like.
Got it. That's really, I didn't even think of that. If you already have a property management team in place, leveraging them, and maybe depending on the type of wedding or the type of event you plan on having, it could be an extension of their services, depending on, of course, who the company is.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you were talking about legal, I wanted to interject something really quick. There is really something to be said for finding a lawyer who has put together a contract for weddings before. And I can't emphasize that enough, because I personally have spent so much money on lawyers who don't know anything about our specific industry. And they'll write a contract because they're happy to take your money, but it won't be specific and custom enough, and there won't be the different protections that you'll need, and it'll be written it will be written in a way that is closest to what they can associate the wedding venue with based on their experience. And that's totally fair, but it won't necessarily do the job that you're looking for the contract to do. And so, yeah, I would highly recommend finding someone. It doesn't even have to be like a wedding lawyer or a wedding venue lawyer. It just needs to be someone who has written a contract for this before, has gotten some feedback, and understands the risks and everything that are in play.
Yes, for sure. So I'm working with a client currently who he calls himself a recovering contract attorney because he retired from that because he was making way more money in real estate development. And so I told him, like, I'll send you a link. You can purchase the contract, send it to me. I will customize it for you. You get access to the attorney that's on my team if you have any questions. He's like, oh no, darling, I'm a recovering contract attorney. I'll write my own contract. I said, great, send it over. I'll proofread the heck out of it for you. He sent it over, and I said, can I have your permission to send this to my attorney? And he said, well, why? And I said, well, I am not an attorney by any stretch of the imagination, but I can definitely see where there's holes in this, and I don't mean any disrespect to your work, but you're not coming from the wedding industry. So like there's certain clauses that you need in there that most don't think of because they're so specific to weddings and events, right? And so anyway, I got his permission and we got it all squared away. But it's just so funny because even a contract attorney who spent 25 years doing nothing but writing contracts, and he got it pretty solid. But again, there's these little nooks and crannies within the wedding industry that you have to just know to include in those contracts. So.
Totally. And this is by no means saying that you can't start with something like that. The risk you run is you learn, and those are some painful lessons along the way. And so that's really, that's what this podcast is all about, this show. It's like, can we help you shortcut some of those lessons and, diffuse some of the pain that you'll have to go through as you learn and as you're in this industry. If we can kind of share that stuff up front, then it'll be way better.
Yeah, for sure.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much. This was fun. I think there's an incredible opportunity for people who have Airbnbs and maybe already have a little bit of traction in terms of reviews and things like that. And I think it's an exciting opportunity for people. You just got to have to know some of the things to navigate.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. All right. We'll see everyone in the next episode.
Hey friends, Jonathan here, and I wanted to share about Common Sense Events consulting packages. If you are a venue owner and you're struggling with your marketing, your sales, your operations, or maybe there's just, you're new to the industry and you want to really have a leg up and get a jump start on getting your business going and not make a lot of the mistakes that oftentimes people make, the mistakes that we made, frankly, when we first started, we would love to chat with you and see if there's a way that we can serve you. Our team has experience working with over 10 venues all across the United States, doing consulting. We've hosted hundreds and hundreds of weddings at this point, and we know what it takes to be successful. If this sounds interesting to you, we would love to chat with you. You can either reach out by filling out the link in the description of the video or podcast, or you can just email us at venues@cseventservices.com, and we would love to chat with you and see if there's a way that we can serve you. All right, back to the show.